Okay, it should be recording now. Yeah, hi everyone. A few more things have been on my mind over the past few months, and I like making these videos because I feel like it helps some people who resonate with some of the things that I'm saying, and they're also kind of like a diary slash journaling activity for me, so I can look back at my own thoughts and see how they have progressed over time. Anyway, I've been fine. I've just been doing what I usually do, creating artwork in my free time, work, that sort of stuff. So that's all good. And today I wanted to talk about more about the modeling and the cosmology that has been the current theme of the past few videos that I've been making. And just to preface, like all of these ideas, so if you go back and take a look at starting from the consciousness feedback loops, proxies, and mantra 50% rule, then to why escaping the matrix is encoded, the full cosmological model breakdown, to then like is this the afterlife, and comments on the problem with soul track research. They're all interrelated. Um, they're not disparate ideas. They're holistically tied together into this big model. So if you're interested, I suggest taking a look at those first, because today I'm gonna talk about what I think gnosis is and some observations around the spiritual ego of souls, and how I kind of feel like the soul as a concept is really no different from the NPC, as I feel like the soul is a part of within the idea and the domain of mind of what we would refer to as the demiurge, or other people would call it Watiko or the Matrix, or the demon that hosts this realm, whatever you want to call it. I'm not specifically tied to Gnostic terminology. However, I do use it, as I feel like we have to use language to pinpoint something as a means to communicate. So the first thing I want to talk about is to retouch upon a point I made in the last video, which was to talk about uh, what I think the reason for starting to seek truth is in this place. And based on the cosmology, I actually don't think that there's this distinction between spirit and the demiurge, the idea of the material world by the demiurge and whatever other multiverses it's created within the sphere of its mind. What I think the demiurge is, because I can't see how the demiurge could be exempt from a totality, if it is that we are noticing a difference between us and the demiurge's will, which is towards this entropy, this attractor towards entropy and cannibalization. If we're noticing that, then there has to be something which hosts the distinction between the two. So, for instance, like I can see that the demiurge is different from my own real will, which is towards symbiosis and creation, which is what this seems to try to prevent us from doing in this place. So there has to be a limit to my knowledge, um, at least as my form as a sovereign, individuated piece of consciousness. Um, but there has to be a totality which accounts both for myself and the will of some other entity, that being the demiurge or some other sovereign being. Um, so I'll go into it a little bit later, in regards to the soul's cosmology of sovereignty, and how I think that there has to be an all, but they can be an all and they can be sovereignty at the same time. There's no distinction in my mind. And I'm not talking about the New Age one either. But anyway, so the demiurge is part of spirit. However, I think it's more like the case where, you know how you might have an anxiety attack, or you would have a bad thought that you can't break out of. It's kind of like that situation, or like a cancerous growth. And I think it's very possible for the mind of God to have to fall under some kind of mistake or misunderstanding in the same way that we can, if you're going on the philosophical notion of correspondence. I think that perhaps this is what's going on, just on a much grander cosmic scale, um, which is fine. And that's not to say that the demiurge should be looked upon as something to be cherished. It really is some kind of an abomination, and it really is exactly like a cancer, um, through cannibalization and enslavement, subjugation and entropy. There's really it's really going against what its intention is, which is to thrive and survive, but it's doing that through without unconditional love, but through enslavement, which is why it's kind of like a blind idiot god, as the Gnostics refer to it as. Um, so so there's that, um, and you know, so I'm thinking that, and I'll go into this a little bit later. Like I said before, I don't think that it's possible for spirit to actually be incarnate here, mainly because the substance of what it's made of is the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy, and you have to be a part of the cannibalization in order for you to exist as an entity here. And I say you because I have to use language to point at specific things. But when I say you, I'm not necessarily referring to your entire identity being the body. I'll just say that there seems to be some kind of spiritual representation. If you take a look at my proxies and feedback loops video, the first one in this sort of series, I talk about how it's possible to represent certain pieces of information through different mediums. A medium is a substance that can host energetic potential, such as a circuit board, for instance, hosts different voltage levels, which is just a differentiation in the medium, which is would be in this case like silicon and copper and gold. Differentiation is just pure information, but and it's information which can be transferred, not necessarily the the medium itself. So if we are just, check out my cosmology video if you don't understand this, but if we're outside of this place and we are proxying our will through the demiurge's mind, if spirit can't incarnate within the idea of entropy and the cannibalization, which is the demiurge's mind, then it appears to me that there's some kind of spiritual representation. There's this idea of the human race with an ego, which is a byproduct of the natural world, which is a lower order, lower resolution byproduct of the natural world. Animals don't have egos, but humans are unique in that they have egos, which is kind of like a feedback mechanism to the self. Is certain humans are represent spirit here, first through from the outside, then through a soul, which is in my opinion another body, then to the actual physical body. Then there's a representation which the human body is designed to be accompanied with an ego, which either gets programmed externally through the hive mind or internally. And when I say the hive mind, I'm not just talking about I am talking about this all-encompassing mind of the demiurge, which actually consists of a bunch of other subsidiary wills and intents, which could be seen as entities or beings, that have the same sort of that basically saying multiple entities can inhabit the human host, not just the spiritual essence, which is from outside this place. So that's where the 50% rule comes in, and check out that video if you haven't seen it. In that, if the predominance of your mind is taken up by the spiritual representation, so this translates physically down to the literal neuronal structures or patterns of information and potential and information flowing through the neurons in the brain. The majority of that is capable of resonating with certain spiritual notions that has a higher vantage point, and that's able to see more as opposed to being a part of the program, which is how the NPCs and some souls seem to act in this place. So what I'm saying is that the ego can be programmed either internally by the true self or externally by the hive mind at large, but either way it gets programmed, and its representation is if the spirit encompasses most of the mental real estate and is able to produce a positive feedback loop, which is additive over time, which is then able to get a foothold of most of the totality of the mental real estate, as opposed to if the hive mind has a majority occupancy, then over time it degrades and pushes out the spiritual essence, as that is subtractive over time. It's a negative feedback loop. So the ego is going to get programmed in some way, and it either represents in its totality mostly the hive mind or mostly the spiritual essence. And I would argue that the spiritual essence is grossly outnumbered in its place. Grossly, and I'm talking about less than 1% of the population. But it gets the ego gets programmed either way. So I'm thinking that if the actual medium of the spirit isn't even here, but this is more a spiritual representation, then it would seem to me that the ego gets developed as a survival mechanism. So you learn the language, you learn the culture, you learn how to navigate and how to rely on other human beings who have certain special skills, so that it ensures physical survival. The ego's a nice tool to enable that, and the hive mind has hacked it in various ways to exploit it for slavery purposes. We all know that. But I'm thinking, if the spiritual essence is there, then it mixes with that desire to become aware of the environment. That's why it starts seeking truth, because it's trying to understand what the fuck is going on here, who it is, what its place is, what is this place, to know what it knows, to know what it doesn't know, to know what it can't know, and to know, like what it knows that it doesn't know. And it's and I think this is the whole reason about this. It's how you can translate spiritual understanding to actions in this place, which better enable survival to reduce pain as you get through this experience, because I've basically concluded that this place is fucked now. There's no saving the human species, because they've proved it through their actions, even in the people who are supposedly against the system in the New Age, that they don't really have the mental fortitude to look into what's actually going on here, which would then enable them to diagnose a problem, which means diagnosis is through through knowledge, and they're not doing that. And I won't go into it here, but basically I think that this is a lost cause. So for me, it's just better off to ride out this mistake. And yeah, like I said in the cosmology video, it doesn't matter if you get thrown out in the trash anyway, you just get reabsorbed into primordial soup to be merged into something else that isn't of this polarized entropic cannibalistic idea of the demiurge. Um, so I want to move on to like what I think gnosis is, and uh, so the spirited individual tries to seek truth to form a model of what it thinks is going on here to better enable survival, and it comes up with it can first look into like the sciences, mathematics, to understand the physical world, and then it delves into the area of philosophy. It tries to look for certain principles, which the principle means that it's first coming, it's before anything else, it's the underlying cause of a thing, it's the ideal form of something. Then there's the notion of an axiom, which is a perceived truth in regards to what you think a principle could be, and this enters into the domain of philosophy because coming out of science, which demands that you're capable of producing a hypothesis and then testing that hypothesis through some physical measurement device that's then able to confirm a theory. And psychology goes to the limits of that in that you have to take on subjective accounts and it can't be measured directly. That's why the psychology could be argued to be a kind of pseudoscience, but this is the foundation level at which you can try and understand these sorts of things in a tangible way that's enables you to best navigate this life that's translatable to actions in the real world. Um, so there's this notion of principles and axioms, and this is what I think gnosis is. It's breaking things down to uh, basically to its foundational levels, and it enables you to then notice the effects of principles, and it truly gives you discernment because you can now look at something and instead of putting in a bunch of mental resources to try and figure out what it is, you can notice certain things about it. So you can notice certain things about it which would enable you to bypass all of that time wasting. So when I'm talking about gnosis, I'm talking about things such as the statement that truth can't be captured in language. So language is basically the ego, and it's a byproduct of nature, the natural systems. And in a similar way, so more so to truth can't be captured in language, a principle could be said that the demiurge tries to copy, because it's basically a bad copy of creation. Whenever it copies and creates other universes in and of itself, it always does it to low resolution because its substance as a medium is entropic in nature. It always has to create something to lower resolution. So a good example of this would be that you see me, I'm a pixelized representation of the true self. If you were to zoom in on the image of me on your video, or even zoom in on the audio as sound waves or as light waves, you would see digitized, quantized bits of information which don't represent an analog signal, which would be equivalent to if you were to actually meet me in person. So this is a egoic representation, which is the technology that has been projected as a byproduct of natural systems, which is the human body, and the ego comes out of that as lower resolution. Therefore, when talking about such things, the moment you try to capture the truth in language, it's already been corrupted by the demiurge because it's of lower resolution, because it's creating another reality within its mind. And yeah, so that's an example of something which I would consider gnosis. That is a principle. So an example of how this allows you to get out of certain situations is that you know now that to search and to try and find the ultimate truth as captured in language is an impossible feat, because it cannot you cannot capture higher order information within something that's of lower resolution. It's just not possible. In the same way that as you're looking at me and hearing my voice right now, you can't actually hear. I'm not actually there with you. It's not a true representation. I cannot be captured because I'm not physically present with you in person. So, that's an example of gnosis, something that is, I would say, principle based on a deduction of logic. So I'll get into the difference between deductive and inductive logic in a little bit. I just want to move on to the other gnosis principles that I've just noticed within my own life. Um, Another thing that could be said, yeah, that I've already said, spirit cannot be present here. Yeah, because the medium is of entropy and cannibalization. Therefore, if spirit is inherently symbiotic and creation based, then it can't exist here, because if symbiosis and creation actually existed here, this sort of entropy and cannibalization, then this place would cease to be, because it is wholly of a different substance to the demiurge. So that's my argument for why spirit is represented here, and we're not actually trapped in these bodies or these souls. It can only be proxied information. That's another example. Um, Also, yeah, to add to that, as another principle, you cannot represent unconditional love here, and I think that this ties into why spirit can't be incarnated here. Um, if you were to represent unconditional love here, it would be equivalent to you giving away all your money to the first homeless person you meet on the streets, and then you're left out for the sharks in the water. And yeah, there's inherent scarcity. We have to work to acquire nutrition, energetic potentials in the form of sugars and things to replace our amino acids in the form of proteins, and to store that energy in the form of fat, in order to have a continued existence. Because everything with the entropy, it's all trying to bring this energetic potential, which is the human body and the molecular configurations, which is kind of like, which stores energy. Um, so like sugar is a good example of this. It breaks down into ATP in the cells, which then can be converted to mechanical movement. But that's actually just a stored energetic potential, which its origins pinpoints back to the sun. So, um, so this is the situation that life's in, and by that sort of observation, you can see that there is scarcity, and that ideal of the unconditional love is impossible here. It's all conditional. You have to pick and choose your relationships, with others. Yeah, so another axiom would be to say that duality exists here, but more so there's an attractor towards entropy, it's not balance. So that's the second law of thermodynamics. So that's another point that I would make to say that spirit's not actually from this place. It seems to be wholly against the will of spirit, which is to, that nothing should ever really die in creation, and um, cannibalization is wholly against symbiosis. And then also to make the point about religion. So, religions and cults, what I would say the principle is that there's always some kind of savior program. So, it's going to be some kind of major event, some rapture, some figure, some deity is going to come and save you. So that then takes responsibility off of your shoulders to some external, which then houses your mind in a cage, because there's like an emotional association with the savior figure. And I see this all the time, not just in the Abrahamic religions, but in certain New Age circles, and even in this community, with particular people who have religious mindsets. And because what happens with the emotional attachment is that there's a unwillingness to hear contrarian opinions, and they don't even recognize the backlash that they give, uh, without reason, because perhaps the contrarian opinion is not argumentative based, because the person making the contrarian opinion doesn't have emotional attachment to ideas. But then that's seen with the spiritual ego of the person who is religious as an attack, because they've become associated with the demiurge at this point, which one of its mechanisms is to protect its various egregoric cells in its body. That's the whole thing around religion. So these are examples of what I would consider to be gnosis. These are root principles, direct causes, which allows you to bypass a lot of the fluff and uh, information out there, because there's so much information that it becomes overwhelming, and it can save a lot of time, uh, and it can make you have discernment as well around certain individuals who might be giving you pieces of the truth, but might also be mixing that in with a lot of lies. And it's not to say, oh, because this person has been outed as a shill, that you should just throw them out completely and not listen to what they say. I'm always interested because they have some things to say, and I'm able to pick it out. And if I can understand it and fit into my cosmology, then that's all good, and the rest can just be thrown out. Um, so what else do I have in my notes? So I've written here that gnosis does not include gnosis does not include effects which are symptoms of the cause. So these are usually things which are outside of yourself, uh, and they can be more taken as supplements to a foundational model, as opposed to being taken as seriously as they have been. So an example of this would be um, gematria, numerology, alternative world theories such as Tartaria, the shape of the world, whether it's flat, cube shaped, pyramid shaped, whatever. Um, Synchronicities that you see outside of yourself. I suppose that's sort of like gematria and numerology. Like religious savior style events. The rapture or the disintegration of reality, for instance. I'm waiting for that. Astrology, crystals, sorcery, so low level magic in regards to acquiring a physical advantage, symbolism in media, uh, an appeal to authority with old religious texts, like the 144,000 thing is an example. Um, just because they're old doesn't mean that they have value. Misunderstandings of the shadow work to have everything internalized with no action. Uh, and this is the same thing as New Age solipsism, just with a different coat of paint. And I've seen a lot of that been thrown around in these circles. Um, so the reason why I can say such things, that I wouldn't consider these things to be gnosis, is that these are events which are outside of yourself that you have no control over, um, and you have to, in my opinion, at least this is what I do, um, you have to um, model everything from the outside in. Outside in, sorry, I meant inside out, from within outwards. Your life, if you can diagnose something through knowledge, then you have the capacity to use your creative spark with it. So for me, I always look for the causal chain of events which links directly back to me, such that I can use it in a practical way, and it's translatable to actions that I can take. So this is an inside out approach. You stop at the gaps of causality that you can't understand. For myself personally, I started off with the sciences and mathematics, like growing up, so that I could understand the physical world around me. Mainly something like physics, then chemistry, then biology, then psychology, which has now led me into philosophy. Um, as we start to get out of the domain of science. Um, and this is a deductive process, which is to, take things down, strip things down to their principles. So these things, which I don't consider to be gnosis, but more supplementary topics, are examples of inductive logic, where you take disparate events outside of yourself and then you can find correlation, and correlation is not necessarily equal to causation. I'll talk about this soon in the logical fallacies parts of my notes here. Um, and you can make philosophical notions of what you think might be right, and I think a lot of the time this is where souls trip up on themselves, because they think that they see the correlation and they take that as truth. And this is, a good example of this would be with astrology or crystals. So with astrology, there's this notion that because the physical domain is all connected, and you could argue that all forms here are representations of spiritual essences, um, like I said before, that because the stars are innately connected to us, and because we're made of stardust, essentially, the physical form at least, and that because the stars and the celestial bodies represent these wills and intents, that they somehow control human destiny. And I've not met someone who's able to explain to me exactly how that works. Um, because the celestial bodies will affect the natural ecosystem on Earth, for instance, the tidal system on Earth. Then why could I not say then that um, it is the natural systems of Earth and not the stars, which then has plays a part in human destiny instead of the stars exclusively? But you see, they're all tied together. But then you could make the argument that um, it could be based on personality differences with astrology could be based on weather. For instance, like I think there's a particular sign that is more associated with wisdom and melancholy because it's born in the winterous periods, or there could be, and the melancholy could come from the fact that there's less food available in the environment. So the people who create these sorts of systems come about it from a very egocentric point of view. So, in old religions, they might say that the sun gets swallowed up by a malice god in the evening, only for it to be reborn in the end, or the tide comes in for, um, the sun comes up to provide energy, and the tides come in to water the crops. So it's all based around living conscious entities who have an intent to um, affect human destiny. But that's not necessarily true. It can be impersonal as well, and I think it's probably a mixture of both. But um, and when people also make certain claims about certain properties of your star sign or certain properties of crystals, how can you distinguish between the fact that someone's given you this notion that this is what this thing has as a property, um, versus whether it's actually having an effect on you? And like I said, I think it's probably a mixture of both, but this is why I don't take these things which aren't principles very seriously, because these are intangibles which can't be deduced with through deductive logic. Certain principles which are directly useful. Yes, you can engage in the gematria, numerology, tartaria, the symbolism in media, whatever, what have you. You can engage in all these things, but there's no causal relationship to something which you can use, like practically. Um, like the gnosis of how truth can't be captured in language does have a practical application because it allows you to bypass certain mechanisms which siphons your energy. So this is the sort of interesting scenarios I see. Um, People will end up getting trapped in these fault loops and rabbit holes which really go nowhere, and they will look at effects for many years which revolves around the same underlying principles, whereas if they just knew the principles through gnosis, then they would be able to bypass that. And actually what these things do, I think, is a tactic by the Matrix itself or the Demiurge in order to get people to waste their times and to impoverish their lives, trying to find the truth in language which can't be done, and they end up just running around in circles like a dog chasing its tail for many years, and they got nowhere, and they've done nothing with their lives in regards to alleviating their pain. So the Demiurge loses them in that sense, um, and it does it subtly. It does it in a way that's particularly tailored for them, in a way that uh, is hooks onto their particular traumas for um, what I think is a life script. If you go onto my cosmology video talking about how I think salvation is encoded, that's with influence of the representation of spirit, but also it's very possible that the demiurge also encodes its own will into these lower dimensional forms like soul and body, for instance. I hope I'm making sense. It's so multifaceted that I really struggle to capture everything. But it's like what I said, truth can't be captured in language. Um, yeah. What else did I say? So yeah, it's an inside out understanding. um, using deductive logic, uh, you're able to sift through the relevancy of information, and it brings about true discernment, and it allows you to bypass one of the demiurge's tactics it uses on souls in this place. Now, why am I saying the soul specifically and not spirit? If you go into my cosmology video again, I'm just relaying information about the three types of man, which is just not, it's not common, it's not common knowledge, but it's not new knowledge either. It's been about for thousands of years. I think in these circles there's a fixation exclusively on NPC and soul, perhaps because a lot of them are sold, um, and they don't have spiritual representation. But when I say that there's three types, it's actually more of a spectrum. However, you need to use language to denote certain polarized, because the nature of language is polarized, certain polarized archetypes. So the NPC is an extreme example. Um, the spirited man is an extreme example. I don't think that spirited man exists here because of the gnosis that it's impossible for spirit to incarnate here because it's the complete opposite of the medium of the demiurge. So it's more of an ideal, and any spirit that is here is just the informational spirit as a representation. Um, so you know, the three types of man is a spectrum in my opinion. So when I say people are sold, I'm just talking about in the majority of their actions. It would be in how we define the archetype of the soul. In the same way, if you say an NPC, I think that there might be some essence of soul within them, but they're so completely overpowered by hive mind programs that you might sort of just lump them in with the archetype. But it's not labeling, it's using language to communicate something. Um, so, in regards to the soul, I think it's um, and you know, props to Mariah from Can You Stand the Truth's channel for bringing about this. I highly suggest going checking out her content. She brought this to the light that there's three types of man, and in my opinion, I think that the soul is just another body within the demiurge's mind. In the same way that the NPC has its own ego, and the limits of its cosmological modeling extends to the consensus reality of geopolitics, and they can't see the lie in it. So, you see, has a similar thing in regards to the extent of its cosmological modeling ends at the soul trap and sovereignty. Now, the soul, because it's a body of a higher order degree, can notice what the physical NPC is. But the soul does have a spiritual ego, so the reason why the soul can see the NPC is because, in the same way that we can create artificial life forms in computers and put them into virtual worlds like video games, they couldn't they couldn't be aware of us who hosts the computer, who hosts the virtual world as an extension of the egoic mind, unless they look at it through a proxied understanding, which is what I'm advocating in regards to our situation here and spirit. So the soul can see the physical NPC, um, but they might not necessarily understand what spirit is, because in the same way that the NPC is just entirely the hive mind at this lower dimensional level, the soul is also the hive mind at this immaterial level. Um, and the reason why I say that is because the people who are exclusively sold, don't ever move past this soul trap modeling and just this conclusion that that's it, you escape the soul trap and then you're sovereign, and then what else is there? Um, for me, this is a really small slice of the pie. This is there's a lot more going on here than just the discussions around there. Uh, so what is so essentially what the soul's cosmology is around would be to say that there's this soul trap, you escape it, uh, but the soul trap is one in time. So they're creating this model that they think is going to happen when they die, and there's going to be a sequential set of events, and you're also going to have the same intellectual faculties as you do here in a place where there's no human body either. Not to mention the fact that the demiurge, if the soul trap is part of the demiurge's mind, it presents the information to the spiritually gullible, who then relay the information back here. It has seeded all of these ideas, all of these accounts, and presented them as egoic structures. So then you think that you've confined the truth in an egoic structure, which is essentially language, but you can't contain truth in language, and because thought is part of the demiurge as well. So then, for people like us who are aware of the accounts given by people, hundreds of people, that this is what happens, it then just throws a completely different set of circumstances tailored to you. Um, so I think it's more a state of mind than a body of information. But then the soul is the completely soul types will just completely be consumed by this information and trying to complete this body of information captured in thought, captured in language. But then, from where I'm coming from, um, there's just this information of all these various accounts. There's very common behaviors and things which you observe amongst these accounts, such as stuff like the white light. Then you get patronized by certain spiritual authorities. Some of them even violently try to haul you back here. They tailor it in regards to anthropomorphic forms, which means human attributes. So they'll have like your loved ones or family members, things of that sort. So there's this. Okay, that's just information. Then I move on. There's no need to relentlessly consume this information for years, which is what some people do, uh, especially knowing that the truth can't be captured in language. So uh, that's all there is to it. But then what the soul is doing is it's just looking at all these various effects, and it's just running around in circles, looking at the same thing just with a different coat of paint, time and time again. Doesn't move past that cosmology. There's a lot more going on, in my opinion, based on based on the model that I've come up with, um, out of the various ideas and information that I've been exposed to, synthesizing it into a holistic framework. Um, so okay, so the soul is essentially, in my opinion, like another NPC of the demiurge's mind, just at a different level. It has various defense mechanisms, just like NPCs do, to defend its cosmology. The NPC's cosmology is the geopolitics, so they will refuse to see the conspiracy, the nefarious intent behind it, because they don't look at the principles behind the effects of the television, the mainstream media. The soul doesn't look at the principles behind the various information that the demiurge is presenting to it, and it comes up with various defense mechanisms Let me see. What did I put down here? Uh, so firstly, it claims that the extent of its cosmology is sovereignty. There's no such thing as one. So I think when that's being said, it's an inherent rejection of this New Age notion of oneness, which is demiurgic, which is another example of this religious mindset, and a savior figure or savior event, which is like 5D ascension in the New Age and merging uh, into one. And I guess, yeah, you wouldn't want to be, well, I wouldn't want to be a part of that. Um, but what I can't understand is that how do you account for infinity? How do you account for the gaps of your knowledge? And how can you have two without one? So to imply sovereignty would mean that you are implying that there's a universe within yourself with all-encompassing information. The fact that there's differentiation between yourself as a sovereign being and another sovereign being, there has to be some idea which encompasses the difference that actually ties them all together. So, um, in regards to the gnosis that the demiurge produces lower resolution copies of itself when it creates universes, um, the the mind which hosts sovereign entities um, has to exist to imply that differentiation, to account for infinity, to account for the lack of knowledge that you have as a sovereign being, um, which might not necessarily be in contradiction with creation, but might be in a different form, which is what makes you unique as a sovereign being. But the fact that it's not demiurgic in that the other sovereign being is not a low resolution copy of the original principle, which is the all, but more for the idea that the sovereign beings are symbiotic with each other, and they're all representations of the underlying will of unconditional love, and this negation of subjugation and entropy and cannibalization, which is what the demiurge is all about. So, what I'm saying is that um, the one is more of an idealistic concept of absolute principles, or you could think of it like the Platonic world of ideals that is the common glue between sovereign entities, which represents the common values and principles that they all hold in order to create the symbiosis to aid in each other's evolution, to aid in each other's creation. You, for me, it doesn't make sense to say that there is no one. I think you have to account for infinity, but you can say that there is a one without negating your own sovereignty. So this is what I'm saying in regards to the soul just thinks that it's sovereign and that's it, and then there's no more questions to be asked, and that's the extent of its cosmological modeling. I just don't see this coming out of souled individuals. They just sort of take that as a final conclusion, and then they want to expand upon the information that they're around this topic without looking into other areas of like cosmology. So in a similar way to how the physical NPC um, has the extent of its cosmology being geopolitics, it then looks to materially expand, which is why they're materialistic and um, can be are inherently selfish and greedy. Um, it's a similar kind of thing to what's going on with the soul, because I consider the soul to just be another NPC, just sort of a higher order. And this it seems like another point I made in my cosmology video is that the the only way for spirit to be represented at this level of reality has to be through a soul proxy, because it seems like soul is a prerequisite. So the spirited man also has a soul as a body as well as a physical body. But you can, in the same way you can get an NPC, you can get a soul with no spiritual essence. And I will preface this: it's a spectrum. It's not to say you're purely sold. That I think you can't label people like that. So yeah, I'll just reiterate that point again. So like the soul man in that case then assumes that it's spirited. Uh, in the same yeah, so this is in the same way to how the NPC thinks that it understands reality. That's why the soul man thinks that it's spirited, but you can see it in their refusal to go beyond this bubble of information that has actually just been exposed to them from outside sources. Um, because the souled man uh, doesn't look doesn't have inherent gnosis in the sense that it doesn't look for principles. So and this is around the topic of knowing what it is that you don't know, knowing what it is that you can't know. Um, it's not looking for um, the underlying causes of things. It's looking at the effects in the same way to how NPCs look at geopolitical effects and take it verbatim. This way, um, souls are capable of understanding gnosis, but not the inherent intent behind the gnosis, which is the principles. Then what I've observed is that the souled man can mix this gnosis with other botched philosophies because there's no discernment. So just going through my notes again, another thing I've noticed is that they repeat the current conspiracy. So this is ties into the point of them just consuming information relentlessly without looking for the principles behind it. So yeah, if they encounter any contrarian opinions, they will admit that they don't understand what you're talking about, but they still have an opinion on it. So this is another red flag to me. If you don't understand something, ask people about it, because this could be a piece of the puzzle that you're missing. And by the way, when I talk about spiritual ego, um, I also have one too, because I'm sold. Like I said, I think that spirited man is an ideal here. However, it's for the soul to humble itself in the presence of gnosis. When you don't understand something, just ask about it. Um, this is what people with religious mindsets do when they vehemently defend something that they have an emotional attribution towards, and because that's how their mind works, they don't even understand that they're trapped in this emotional attribution because they are the felt presence of the emotion. Uh, then they claim to be infinite creator beings when all these people are is addicted to the consumption of information. They don't offer any expansion upon the information that's being presented or contrarian ideas or opinions. A lot of them just agree with what's being said, fall under a lot of logical fallacies. So this actually leads me on to discussion about logical fallacies. If I just get up in my notes here, um, it's like a existential threat to them when you try to provide the contrarian viewpoints to the soul trap theory and uh, their modeling of sovereignty. And in the same way that the NPC will defend its viewpoint on geopolitics, they will also defend this. So what I've seen is polarized thinking, so like the rejection of shields of no discernment, when if you have discernment by looking at the principles, you can easily see through that and pick out some nice pieces of truth. uh, because you could be missing out something with certain people who are compromised. um, Emotional attributions towards particular ideas. I've seen this a lot with Gnosticism. You get people being extremely hardcore, almost blaming themselves for the creation of this place, uh, wanting to become complete aesthetics and disregard their bodies. And then when this extreme viewpoints uh, causes them to lose motivation, they then flip to the opposite viewpoint and completely reject Gnosticism because they had ascribed shame or blame or depression towards this idea. Whereas to me, I'm not a Gnostic. Let me get that straight. I use certain Gnostic terms like gnosis, the demiurge, Helix, pneumatic psychics in regards to the three types of man, soul spirited, and NPCs. And but I'm not tied to it. It's just information to me. There's no emotional attribution to it. I don't see it as a philosophy that's going to be my savior because this is an externalized idea. It helps model my own cosmology and understanding of the world. It's greatly informed that, but I've never had emotional attachment to it. So yeah, this is the sort of point that I'm making, the polarized thinking. Um, Also, like thoughts on um, technology, which also ties into appeal to nature, logical fallacies. There's a complete rejection of technology, which in a lot of cases can be tools to use to for us to get around a lot of our suffering here. Uh, as for instance, there's a rejection of blockchain technology, which, when you actually understand it, the principles behind it is actually neutral, and it's just being used in a way that's going to control people by them creating systems that are not centrally controlled through the decentralization, but then creating the human lifestyle around control. For instance, you can see this a lot in China. Imagine that, but just decentralized. So now it's not like you could destroy the Chinese government and then uh, get rid of the system. The system would be hosted globally, and people would be incentivized to host the technology. But if we were to do it ourselves, we can create systems which get around censorship or allows you to bypass certain. Well, I won't say it here. Bypass certain theft to your labor, should I say, that you then have to support the government with. You can get around that by creating your own ecosystem, um, encrypted messaging, which gets around that. Ways to encode information in the internet that can't be censored, but then to encode our own information into it. So, and it's just a polarized way of thinking to just completely reject certain new forms of technology when you can essentially fight fire with fire. It's here now and it's coming to basically enslave us unless spirit takes conscious control of it. Uh, so another logical fallacy I've seen has been for people to use straw mans. So this is essentially putting words in your mouth. So what I've heard a lot of people say to me in my own personal experiences, because you talk about uh, spirit being outside of this place, and that kind of like the soul is kind of like an NPC just of a higher order within the demiurge's mind. Then there's this place which we have an immediate experience of, and the NPC. that there's some kind of spiritual hierarchy, and I've never said such a thing, but because there's the assumption of this vantage point that they're somehow better or worse, and there's emotional attribution towards this idea of hierarchy. It's just information. It's just what you can observe with the inner eye and the eyes which point outwards about what could be happening. Uh, but then through that, then there's a kind of shadow projection because they don't notice this within themselves, and then they essentially put words in your mouth, which is a straw man. Then they misrepresent what you're saying, and then will switch the topics completely. So I've had very schizophrenic discussions when trying to share information with people, where there'll be an original point to be made, such as like a gnosis principle. There'll be a disagreement with that because to the soul, the gnosis principle threatens their cosmology and essentially threatens the existence of themselves. In the same way that the NPC can't see the corruption in geopolitics because it destroys their concept of the hive mind, and that government's actually there to help them and to support them. So they'll do that, and then they will take what you say, disagree with it, you'll respond to it, then they will take that response and connect it to something completely fucking different from the original point that's being made. Then you try and get them back on track, then they see that you pointing out that you want them to get back on track to the original point as a disregard of their original response. So it's just such a fucking schizophrenic thing to deal with, and there's no logical consistency. It's very reactionary. It's very in the moment, and it just appears to be robotic to me. It seems like there's a complete breakdown of communication in that regards. Very interesting thing I've noticed. Maybe you've noticed it too in your interactions with these types of people. A big point for another logical fallacy is that correlation is equal to causation. So this is a really bizarre thing I've noticed. The human mind can find a pattern in anything if it really wants to. So for instance, I could say the spirals of the galaxy looks like the double helix of your DNA, which is related then to snakes entwined around each other, which is then a representation of the Kundalini energy. And then there's the axis mundi, which then connects to the inherent energies of the earth. And then the earth then has a connection to the stars, which then have an influence on human destiny. And then because in the zodiac you can see that there's I don't know, somewhere in there there's three types of signs that then relates to something that you would find in this obscure religious text, which then must mean that whatever that religious text says has to be taken seriously because of this chain of causality. And you could say fucking anything you want it to, but the correlation is not necessarily equal to the causation. Just because of something seems to be tied to it doesn't mean that that is the cause. And I think that this is like early signs of schizophrenia, in my opinion. Um, um, Another logical fallacy I've noticed is the appeal to nature fallacy. Uh, Also, you can talk about homeopathy and allopathic medicine. So, I think a lot of this community consists of people of a qualitative feeling based nature. So, I generally have more of a homeopathic outlook to look at the entire body than the allopathic technique, which is direct um, to deal with an effect, um, and it's good for things such as surgery, or they might produce some drug which targets a specific receptor. So it's more like putting a plaster over a wound, but some things are direct. Um, yeah, like the trauma, for instance. And it's to say that like anything that isn't natural can't be good, and everything that's natural is good. Um, Dogs sniff their own asses. Does that mean humans should do that too? When using animal behavior to describe supposed benefits. So, for instance, um, some people might say, "Oh, veganism is the ideal diet for humans because you can look at herbivorous animals. They eat, like cows. They eat grass all day, and look at how big they grow. But as a human, a cow, um, and some natural products are poisonous, like cyanide, for instance. There's various plants out there that can kill you if you ingest them. Uh, so yeah, there's advantages to homeopathy and allopathic medicine. Um, it's grey area. It's not black and white. Uh, Appeal to authority is another logical fallacy. Um, Again, in regards to diet, uh, it doesn't matter what my diet is. I'm just using this as an example. I've no, in my experience, I've had someone argue that veganism is a inherently inferior diet, um, and they'll present some information, some studies which might be funded by, without them checking, funded by particular authorities. Um, they will. One of them said that shared me a video of a nurse who was bashing out against veganism. It doesn't matter if veganism or eating meat is optimal diet. That's not the point here. They use a nurse as an appeal to authority against veganism, when in the very same light they would then talk in bad light about vaccines because you can say, look, even people in the medical institution, including nurses, are advocating for vaccines as well. So what I found is that uh, especially for people who say that it's all heart and no mind, that they will have a feeling towards something and then they don't actually care for the consistency of their logical arguments. They will kind of pick and choose what seems to fit their feeling and support their feeling at the time, even if when you actually break it down, they logically contradict themselves or have cognitive dissonance. This is very common in the INFP personality type, who's at the forefront an introverted feeler, but will have this externalized thinking, which falls to appeal to authority quite a bit. Uh, the souls will create this sort of fractured logical system where they have one particular chain of reasoning to support that one particular philosophy or argument, when the two multiple chains of reasoning that they've kept in these sort of black box bubbled situations might not might actually contradict each other, and there needs to be, like, in my opinion, some kind of a attempt to put together all these disparate pieces of logical systems and create a holistic, um, synthesized logical framework that's able to account for all permutations and all things. That's the sort of thing that I try to do. So I try to notice the cognitive dissonance within my mind, and I'm not exempt from this process, but I'm honest enough to say that that's where I fall under, and try to bring together um, the parts of my mind that are separated. This is also plays into this inside out deductive logic means of discernment and acquiring gnosis, in that if someone presents something to me, I listen to it with an open mind. I don't necessarily take in everything that they say. I might take bits and pieces that um, that can fit into my model. If someone gives me a piece of information that shatters my model, I can take weeks or even months to, like, deeply contemplate what they're actually saying, because I now need to reformulate and restructure my model such that I can integrate it. Um, and that way I try to remove these cognitive dissonances within my mind. I don't just pick and choose information to that suits my argument at the time. And by the way, I'm an INFP myself, but I don't have. If any of you are familiar with the Enneagram system, which complements MBTI quite well, um, I'm a Type 5, which um, is detached from the emotions. So it's a weird situation for me where I primarily feel my emotions, but I'm also detached from them at the same time. So I'm also able to channel the emotions in a motivational, constructive way, than them being harnessed by the demiurge to defend particular philosophies that I've been exposed to, um, which creates, like, fractured logical systems and brings about cognitive dissonance, logical fallacies, which um, all gets triggered by an existential threat to the limits of my cosmology as a being. Whereas if you're just purely an NPC in the physical, or whether you are the body of the soul in another layer of the demiurge's mind, who's limited in that area, when there's also no hierarchy, to not put words in people's mouths. Um, these are all the things that I notice. These are all the things that you can't talk to them about, because they immediately assume that, and I think some people might be thinking that I'm uh, ranting here. I'm not ranting. I'm just trying to present my observations. I'm trying to present pure information. There's no need to attribute emotion to it. So maybe some of you also notice this as well. I mean, I guess a positive thing that could be said about the soul is that, where it's kind of like Mariah describes the soul as being Sophia's ego, so the spiritual ego has the intent. I mean, you see the New Agers, their intent to merge with the One, their intent to basically say it's all unconditional love and law of manifestation, all that stuff. It has the intent, but because it's a part of the demiurge's mind, it's also perverted. In the same way how the hive mind says that it wants life, when everything it does points towards cannibalism and entropy. Um, but I would say that the soul is more compassionate, and despite the ego and its narcissistic qualities and its closed-mindedness and its inability to think outside of the box that it's been confined within, religiosity, I would say that it does. It can embody, like, higher spiritual um, intense, more so than the NPC. On the contrarian side, the soul types can also be more narcissistic than your mundane NPC, because the soul type assumes that it's spirited when that's not the case at all. You can just observe it in them. They reveal themselves through their actions and what they say and their responses. Um, that there's no humility, there's no intent for understanding what the other person is saying. They don't humble themselves, not in a patronizing way. I don't know everything, and if someone presents a contrarian opinion, I want to know what you mean. If someone disagrees with me here, I want to know. Um, if you can break down what I'm saying, because then I welcome that, because I'm missing certain things, and if someone can add to my model or break it down, yeah, that's all good. Because if it's not true, then it has to be thrown in the trash. Um, so yeah, I think that that's what I wanted to talk about, like what actually gnosis is, the idea of trying to break that down into principles and axioms, and more on the difference between like the NPC and the soul, and how they're really more of the same thing. How the spirit isn't even really here, which is why I think why I made a video on the how the salvation is encoded from outside this place. Like spirit cannot incarnate here. Certain uh, things which what's gnosis and what isn't gnosis, what is the spiritual ego, and discussing the cosmology of the soul, the the talking about sovereignty, various defense mechanisms when you trigger the ego of the soul. uh, yeah, that's I'd say that that's a summary. um, I don't know who understands. I know that some people watch my videos and gain value from it, and this is who I do it for. Okay, I've literally been speaking for nearly an hour and a half now, and I'm gonna wrap this up. Get a drink of water. So I think the main point that I'm getting at here is uh, I don't I don't even think the spirit's even here, and that all of this research is to just try and gain a better understanding of what's actually going on here, and how to just try to alleviate pain. Uh, the soul trap stuff has its limits, and for me personally, it's not worth looking too deeply into that. I don't even think I'm here, like personally. I have a soul, but I'm not even my soul either. The demiurge is spirit, but just in a fallen state. Uh, there is the concept of the demiurgic oneness as it tries to replicate creation, and then there is the concept of sovereignty, and how there can be one and there can be sovereign beings simultaneously. There's no contradiction there, and this original intent to understand the environment. How can you translate your gnosis into actions that you can use to improve your life, and actually have real take real action in the world? Because it's all talk and no action. um, what's consuming information around the same principle for years going to do? Nothing is probably what the demiurge wants. um, just create things, man. Like, I create digital art, and I've been doing it for 5 plus years now to try and make something of it, and do programming in in between that. Um, just learn some skills and just try and um, better your life. And it's not fantastic. It's not fantastical. Like I don't think that the people in power have even perhaps even know what they're doing. They're just being controlled by this hive mind effect. But there's no like there's no actual intent. At least not on the lower levels. Perhaps on the higher levels, they are literal incarnations of the demiurge's will. But from day to day, it's very mundane, and I think that the solution is not some fantastical event or some sorcery that you can engage in or something that's outside of yourself. Through understanding principles, you actually have direct connection with knowledge that is actually translatable to actions. It's not something that you rely on that's outside of yourself, that's spontaneous. Synchronicity is something that you can actually do. Um, so, yeah, I guess that's just what I wanted to say. I'm not interested in wasting my time. I'm interested in thriving in this matrix and alleviating my own suffering and alleviating the suffering from others. And I have to take pragmatic steps towards that. And I understand the relativity of my own mind. I understand that I am sold, um, and there's various guerrilla tactics that the demiurge will use me to try and siphon my energy. But um, I'm actually trying to impart, as a spiritual representation, my will into this place, and one of those avenues is through art. If the alchemical process is to transform lead into gold, not mentally but also physically as well, perhaps that's a metaphor that the spirit, as a representation, as a so-called infinite creator being that everyone throws about when there's no creation happening. What if you actually do the creation? What if you impart your will into the material world such that you can perhaps get around some of the entropic forces? Um, for example, like AI, if you actually understand what it is, it's actually very stupid. It's more of a specialized brain, but you can use AI to for your will as an extension of your own brain uh, to generate complexity that goes against the entropic forces here. I think that there's real magic which can be done, but it's not fantastical by way of sorcery. It's through actual, real principle-based knowledge, which enables you to uh, you actually take actions in this place which matter. So yeah, I think that's the gist of what I wanted to say. Uh, if you want to get in contact, there's a Telegram group still, and I'll leave it in the descriptions. But otherwise, I hope everyone out there um, is doing well, and until next time, adios. Hey guys, I was just about to hit render from the editing, but I remember there's one crucial point that I missed that I wanted to make, so I'm back at it again. So that would be another point on the axioms and principles in relation to gnosis. Uh, where I'm, what I'm saying is my entire model is based on those axioms, those assumptions of principles, but they can never be verified materially through the scientific method. So this is purely in the domain of philosophy at this point. But that's good enough because there's certain unknowns for entities here, and the extent of what they identify with. So if they're NPC, soul, or spirited, um, is confirms the extent of their cosmological exploration and which box they keep their mind within. But there's certain intangibles for the medium, such as like we can't probe with material which is demiurgic of a substance that isn't demiurgic, how um, whatever's outside of the demiurge's influence, spirit cannot be a part of demiurge, therefore spirit cannot be incarnate here, therefore we cannot measure it, therefore you cannot know. With the mind, which is a byproduct of the natural world of or a lower resolution um, uh, uh, a world, this principle of the demiurge trying to copy creation. Um, so therefore you can't know for certain um, what the fuck is going on here, at least with the human mind. That's not even the spirit, that's just the demiurge's manifestation. You just superimpose as a representation, um, using its rules against itself. So the rule is that you have to incarnate as a dualistic being, affected by entropy, all that kind of stuff. But within it is a representation, because we're here and we're talking about, and we're actually observing the demiurge through itself, which is really quite paradoxical and mind bending to think about. Um, but yeah, so then because you can't exactly know, it's a reasonable thing to make a model of some sort, and but this model is not fact. I don't claim to know the truth. It's the best thing that I can do with the limits of the information that I've exposed to, both with my internal eye and the physical eyes that I have. And it's the best working model. That's what I'm trying to say, and we can only act on models, the limits of our perception, to the best we can. But if anyone out there um, can break my proposed axioms or principles, or you got something to add, just let me know, because we're all trying to figure out the best way to navigate through this fucked up reality. But yeah, that's just what I wanted to say. Um, the principle, if my entire model is based around axioms, so um, yeah, that's just the point I wanted to make. Anyway, take care, everyone. Bye.